Welcome to this video. Question for you before we really get into it. Why are you watching this? I want you to think about that real quick. Why are you watching this? Is it because I told you to? Is it because you're really interested in foreign policy, love history class? Or is it because you're looking for a good grade? Think about that. We'll come back to that at the end. Well, this is Chapter 19, U.S. Foreign Policy. We're going to roll through this relatively quickly. The first thing that I need you to do is in your notebook, make sure you have that out. I want you to write down these four terms, and as we go through it, get the definitions for each term. So it's foreign policy, realism, idealism, and neutrality. Go ahead and pause the video quick so you can write those four down, and you'll write the definitions as we go through. So our first question is, what is foreign policy? And basically, it's a set of guidelines and practices that allow, or that a nation actually follows in its relations with other nations. It's basically the rules that we choose for ourselves and how we're going to deal with other countries. And it's a term that you're familiar with, I'm sure. It's also, the polar opposite to domestic policy, which is how we decide to govern ourselves within our own borders. There are some goals of foreign policy, and these really kind of make sense when you think about it. Why do we interact with other countries in specific ways? Well, the first reason is for national security. We want to keep our country safe from attack or from harm, and a lot of people would argue that this might be the most important goal of foreign policy. The second one is to maintain international trade. We make a lot of stuff here, but we don't make everything we need here. So we want to be able to trade with other countries to make sure that our economy is prosperous and that we have all the cool things that we think we need to have, like, iPhones or whatever, history books, all that cool stuff. Another reason that we have foreign policy, another goal is to try to maintain world peace, primarily because when there's war, it disrupts trade. And when there's war other places, it can endanger our security. You will find, as we go through the rest of this class and into high school, that the world wars get started without U.S. involvement, and we're kind of drug into it. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again, even though it happens all the time. And the final goal for foreign policy is to promote democracy. Throughout history, you will find that democracies don't fight each other because in a democracy, people rule, and people are not going to elect governments that elect to go to war with other governments that are elected by the people, if that makes sense. So democracies typically do not fight other democracies, and we want to promote then democracy throughout the world to reduce the amount of war. There are several tools that our government uses when it comes to foreign policy. The first one is diplomacy, and this is just the art of negotiating with other nations. So when leaders get together, they use diplomacy in different ways. And it's just basically having conversations, maybe some arguments, but trying to settle on some sort of common ground so that countries can relate to each other better. Another tool of foreign policy are treaties, and these are formal agreements between two or more governments. There's tons of treaties that America has signed over its history. We are subject to dozens of treaties right now, treaties that you've never heard of, treaties that I've never heard of, but they're formal agreements that we've made with other countries. And it isn't just between two countries. It can be between a host of countries. It could be 10, 20 countries even that enter into treaties. Another tool of foreign policy is an executive agreement, and this is basically what the president comes to an agreement with the leader of another country. Basically, two leaders that agree to this stuff. It's different than a treaty, perhaps a little less binding, because a treaty, as we look back here, these treaties can be negotiated by a president, but they have to be approved, ratified by the United States Senate. An executive agreement does not have to be ratified by the United States Senate. Another tool of foreign policy is foreign aid. How do we get countries to do what we would like them to do? Is we offer them money or food or supplies or some sort of other assistance, and in return we expect that they behave in a certain way or that they trade with us in a certain way, and that's a pretty effective one. We use foreign aid a lot. Trade is another tool of foreign policy. By giving other countries access to our markets, access to our people, access to you and I for buying stuff, that's a pretty big motivation for other countries. But we also make a lot of stuff here that other countries want. And if they don't act in the way we want, we might use trade sanctions, which are put in place to punish another country. We might even have a trade embargo where we will flat out agree not to trade with another country. A sanction means that we will curtail our trade, we'll limit our trade. An embargo means we just flat out won't trade with them. And then if you're one of our really good friends, we might enter into a free trade agreement, which is basically a preferential treatment for another country when it comes to trade. Our last tool of foreign policy is kind of the obvious one that probably everybody thinks about, is military force, right? We've got muscles, and our muscles are our Army and our Navy and our Air Force, those kinds of things, and at times we will flex them to try to influence how another country behaves. So really there's two reasons that one country gets involved with another, or two reasons that the United States is going to interact with other countries, and they're really simple. One is in self-interest, and the other one is in somebody else's interests. Are we doing this for our own benefit, or are we doing this to benefit somebody else? Those are our two big questions, okay? Some reasons to get involved. Can you think of a time the U.S. got involved with another country for self-interest reasons? And take a look at the picture. You know, it's a famous photo from 9/11 when the first tower is going to collapse on 9/11/2001. We're going to get involved in other countries. And are these for self-interest reasons, or are we trying to help somebody else? And ultimately, I think for 9/11, it is for self-interest reasons, right? We're defending ourselves. We were attacked, and we're going to defend ourselves, and that is certainly self-interest. But there are times we get involved in other countries to help somebody besides the United States of America. We're trying to maybe promote democracy in another country to help those folks out. We're trying to get involved in another country because they don't have enough food. So we want to make sure that their folks don't starve to death, you know, those kinds of things. The thing is, we have names for these, okay? Realism and idealism, and those are the two main motivations that drive American foreign policy. There's lots of different little subsets within these. There's lots of nuances to these, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on realism and idealism. Here is the definition of realism. Relations with other nations should be guided by our own self-interest, by absolute practical gains for our nation that benefit the American people. So we're doing stuff to help us. There are things we can actually absolutely gain out of this, and they benefit America. And the examples might be the war on terror, like I talked about with 9/11. The United States was attacked, and it was in our own interest to protect ourselves or to punish those who did it. World War II was another good example of realism. Again, we were attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor, so we get involved in World War II to protect our own interests, to seek revenge or to strike back at those who attacked us. The other side is the idealism, and this definition, so you'll write this down, is that relations with other nations should be guided by our values and ideals, things like democracy and liberty and rights for all people, not just for Americans, and this idea that the world should be made better or safer for all people. This is why we will get involved in some countries to get rid of their governments because their people are being oppressed. So the United States will get involved to try to make things better for somebody else. Syria might be an example of that today. In 1990, we'll engage in the Gulf War against Iraq, and that starts primarily because Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, is going to attack and take over another country. And the United States will lead a coalition of countries to go in there and drive Hussein and Iraq out of that country. And then in 2011, we will engage in some airstrikes on Libya as they're revolting against their government, and we will help their people out to try to get them out of oppression by providing some airstrikes to just to help their revolution. So one final thing, and this is the last thing you need to write down in your notes. It's that a country may decide to do nothing, and this is called neutrality. You're probably familiar with that term. And really the definition of neutrality is it's a state of not supporting or helping either side in a conflict or a disagreement. And another word to think about is impartiality or being impartial. And really, neutrality is almost always motivated by realism. It's self-interest. You can look at the little diagram there. Switzerland is always neutral for a whole bunch of complicated reasons, but they're always neutral. Sweden in World War II is neutral. They're not going to pick the Axis or the Allies. And typically, when countries stay neutral, it's because they don't stand to benefit from getting involved in the war. And if that's the case, that is still, if you don't benefit, that is self-interest reasons. That is realism reasons for not getting involved. Okay? So the last thing, and I asked you this at the beginning of this little presentation, is why are you watching this screencast? Why are you taking these notes? What motivated you to do it? Was it because I told you to do it? Was it because you're wanting to get a better grade in U.S. Studies or on the Chapter 19 assessment? If that's your motivation, that's self-interest. You're acting on behalf of yourself to do well on this chapter or in this class. However, if you're one of the few people probably watching this just because you're genuinely curious about foreign policy, that's why you did it, then that's something different, right? That's more of an idealistic motivation. It's you're trying to do something for an ideal, which is knowledge, or because it's the right thing to do, not because you're getting something out of it, just because you think that as a student it is your responsibility to learn as much as you can. That would be more of an idealistic realization, or an idealistic motivation. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow in class and start applying these things to some real life situations in American history. So hope you enjoyed it. I will see you tomorrow. Thanks, guys.